Hi everybody, welcome to Itsy Bitsy's live read of The Traitor, an underground bad boys romance by India Kells, sponsored by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. Spencer Knox looked outside, enjoying his second cup of coffee, as the sun slowly rose over the lake. Damn, it was cold. Cold and damp, with white shit all over the damn landscape as far as the eye could see. The mountains, the valleys, the fucking roads were slippery as hell. Why had he chosen a small community nestled in the Rockies for his beginning? Maybe because it was as far from the big city as he could get. In his head, a new beginning meant doing something new and unexpected, and he'd made one hell of a decision when he decided to leave the city. Even with the weather announcing the heart of the winter and the snow, he couldn't have chosen a better location for his new home. Isolated by the lake with neighbors he couldn't see, but close enough to town so he could take care of the auto mechanic shop he acquired less than 6 months ago. It was perfect, his second best decision ever. A quick look at his watch told him he had little time left for his workout and shower before heading to the shop, but still, he waited for his lady of the lake. She appeared like a ghost the very first morning he moved to town of Lanston. Surrounded by boxes and unable to sleep, he had been watching the sunrise when he'd seen a feminine form in the distance gliding toward the lake with a wisp of dark hair blowing in the wind. Knox was fascinated by this vision through the trees and couldn't take his eyes off her. He couldn't see her face clearly due to the distance. The woman was wrapped in a brown coat, and for a long moment she stood there immobile. Each morning since he arrived, Knox watched the woman walk by the lake and stand there for the longest time, unconcerned about the weather or the freezing temperature. It was his own personal apprehension that always vanished just as he made a move to go to her. If he hadn't seen her in the flesh, walking the streets of Lanston, he would have thought himself crazy. From a distance, she appeared ethereal. Up close, she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. Knox knew she wasn't beautiful in a conventional way, as she was on the curvier side, but he didn't mind, and his cock sure didn't care. He wished he'd met her in the amenity of the city so he could have had her and left without the risk of having to see her again. He knew very well the kind of man he was, and made sure not to entangle himself in feelings and emotions. He could offer his body, but not his heart. As for his soul, he bargained it away a long time ago, and the devil wasn't handing it back any time soon. As the sun started to lighten the overcast sky, the woman he now knew was Josie disappeared, walking back to her cabin that was hidden behind the trees. She would walk into town an hour later. He wasn't tracking her, but his eyes always seemed to catch on her form whenever she passed by. As Knox put his mug in the sink, he realized he was late and headed out to start his car so at least he wouldn't freeze his ass off. Since winter had arrived, he was always cold, and that pissed him off. He knew he was getting old, but he never imagined having to turn the thermostat up that much. He was happy he lived alone, otherwise he would be nicknamed Grandpa in no time. Grabbing his coat and beanie, he locked the door behind him and hopped into his truck. At least his driveway was clear of snow. Too often he'd woken up to a foot of snow on the ground. His truck was a 4x4, but he lacked experience driving in the snow with that sort of engine. He was used to hard and fast, not slow and easy. That sentiment applied to his cars and his women. As he listened to the local radio station, Knox growled at the snow forecast for the afternoon, not that he could do anything about it. Arriving at his shop, he parked in the back where the snowplow would have enough space to clear the snow if he was busy inside and couldn't get out later that day to move his car. Lowe's Auto Mechanic and Repair stood in the middle of town. It had been a staple of Lanston for so long and was the reason Knox had decided not to change the name. Not the only reason, but a valid one for sure. He hadn't changed much of anything since buying the place. He cleaned everything, repaired or replaced the equipment that required it, repainted others, but had kept the staff on board. Georgia Lowe, the former owner's widow, still manned the front desk, and honestly, Knox wouldn't want it any other way. She had the helm of the ship in a strong grip, and his admin was in a tip-top shape. Marvin and Tom were the two mechanics that worked for him, older gents, talented and never in a hurry to finish jobs. Another sign of the small town was time had a different speed here, and Knox wasn't used to it. He needed someone to help with bodywork and paint, but so far nobody had applied for the job. He was glad it wasn't an emergency at the moment, but knew he might have to extend his search area. Exiting his truck, he unlocked the back door and wasn't surprised to smell coffee brewing. Georgia was always there at least 5 minutes before he was. When he told her to take it easy and that she only needed to arrive a few minutes before opening, the woman gave him a look that almost made him shiver. She'd then proceed to tell him with a few chosen words that she was able to work as many, if not more hours, than he could, and if he wasn't happy with his services, she would go on her merry way. It was an empty threat because Georgia Lowe was a fixture, and when he acquired the shop, he'd had to keep the woman, and she loved being at the front desk. It was the male equivalent of a beauty parlor. It seemed the men of the town loved to gossip, and his place was where they did it. He had been the main focus of said gossips when he arrived. Knox had heard so many ridiculous and ludicrous bits of information, he'd been astonished by people's imaginations. The only thing that kept it from turning into complete lunacy was the fact that he decided to make Lansdowne his home and buy a local business, thus maintaining employment in town. That and the fact that an extramarital affair exploded 2 months after he purchased the business. It was a sure way of distracting the locals and diverting the spotlight off him. After that, he seamlessly integrated into the fabric of the town. Maybe not that easily, but he was accepted by most of the friendly residents. Coffee will be ready in a minute. Knox shred his winter gear in his office and put on a pair of work boots. A clean overall was hanging on the hook, thanks to Georgia. "How are you doing this morning, Spencer?" She made a point of always using his first name, and equally annoyed he rolled his eyes at her. "It's cold. Nothing new." Georgia, as usual, boomed in laughter. The woman was a powerhouse. "You'll get used to it. Your blood will thicken. Winter is only just beginning." Knox bit back a groan. If January was just beginning, he might not survive until the end. Getting himself a fresh cup of coffee, he went to return to his office when he saw his ghost's familiar form walking down the street. Georgia turned to look out the window and sighed. It wasn't like her not to comment on the people passing in front of the shop. Usually, he didn't say anything and tried to avoid gossip, but he'd noticed how his employee never said much about Josie, or repeated any gossip for that matter. "What?" Georgia twisted and frowned at him, as if not understanding his question. "Why did you sigh as she walked down the street?" "At Josie? I sighed?" Knox arched an eyebrow, indicative that she thought she could avoid his question like that. His expression must have been enough because she shrugged, shuffling papers. "There's not much to say about poor Josie. Nothing of interest, as a matter of fact." Even though she tried to dismiss him, his interest was piqued as he looked at Josie's form slowly disappearing from view. "Come on, Georgia. I'm not into gossip, and you know it. However, you are, and Josie is the only person in town you have nothing to say about. Why?" "First of all, reporting news is not gossiping, and I know the difference very well. Second, I told you, the poor girl has enough on her shoulders as it is. She needs support, and that's what we women do. We support each other. And if we men want to help, we're screwed?" "Exactly. It's because you men want to screw us over that we women bond together." Knox wanted to throw his arms in the air and lock himself in his office. Instead, he sighed. "Georgia, I'm not going to discuss this with you if you're going to throw that sort of foolishness in my face. I'm genuinely concerned. When I ask questions, it's because I'm new around here. For God's sake, not because I want all the scandalous details of a person's life. Knox had to admit, he laid it on a bit thick and wasn't as selfish as his intentions as he was making out. The exclusive lady of the lake made him mighty curious. Georgia seemed to consider his words carefully before responding. There isn't much you can do, Spencer. She's deep in debt because of her ex-husband, and she's working as much as she can to pay it all back. It wasn't much information, but it was enough for him to want more, and the bit about her ex made him clench his fists. It reminded him of his punching bag in his home gym. She covered his why didn't she let it all go to the bank and start over? You don't know, Josie. She's as straight as an arrow. Even if you offered her the money to pay her debts, she wouldn't accept it. Instead, she cut back every expense she could think of and took every job she could find. The woman is a harder worker than anyone I know, but Lanston is a small town with small salaries. She needs to pay off the debt before their divorce can be finalized. In the meantime, he got out of Dodge in less than a minute. Poor Josie had to sell everything. She lived in a room nearby at first, but someone offered her a small cabin near yours, although I wouldn't call it a cabin. It's more like a shack from what I remember. She walks to town every morning and walks back when she's done. It's a hellish life, if you ask me. The older woman watched the street as if she could see Josie walking past the shop. Where does she work? Blinking, Georgia shook her head and turned to him. The better question is, where doesn't she work? I know she has a steady job at the inn as maid and at the bakery shop late at night. She was also a cashier at the grocery store for a bit and worked at the restaurant too. As I said, she'll do any and every job. To be honest, I worry for her health, Spencer. No one is able to carry on at that rate for long. I see it in her face. She's fading away and is too stubborn to accept help or even acknowledge she needs it. Knox nodded. It was a desperate situation, but he didn't know what to do. Of course, he could play the good guy and arrive on her doorstep with a bag of food or something, but it would mean getting involved, and that was something he wasn't ready to do. He couldn't and wouldn't care for someone, and Josie's case screamed of needing care. Maybe there was a good couple of things he could ask her to do around the shop, but he would have to think about it. That would be for another time, though. As the day had started and the phone was ringing, Georgia took the call as Knox returned to his office to prepare for his day, with Josie's image lingering in his brain. Thank you for listening to this portion.